Okay, so let's create something you're going to be able to use in your next project, and there's nothing that you need more of than transition effects. You're going to see that by creating it inside of Avid Effects, you're going to be able to get in and tailor it and add more parameters to it than you'd ever be able to inside of Media Composer or Symphony. I'm going to launch the user interface. Once the interface opens up, we're actually going to build this in three parts because there's three main elements that I have going on here. The first part of the effect is going to be the scale down. Second part of the effect is going to be the move over. And last but not least, we're going to add the motion blur. Now we're going to want to have the scale down happen in about 20 frames. Now I should point out that we are working in 24 frames. So if you keep an eye on the time over here, you'll see that we're at 23 frames right now. And as soon as I move ahead one frame, we're obviously now on the 1 second mark. So keep that in mind if you happen to be working in a 24 or 23.98 frame per second project. So what we're going to do is we're going to come right back to the 20 frame mark. And again, many different ways that you can work inside of Avid Effects. For this transition, let's navigate over here to the Video 1 dropdown. I'm going to drop down Video 1. I'm going to drop down transformations. And of course, what I want to do is I want to get into the position parameters because remember, scale is part of position. What's also important to keep in mind, you'll see up here that we have our little link that's locking these two tracks together. So therefore, what I do to the X value, I'm also doing to the Y value. So what we're going to do is we're going to navigate right down here to the X value. I'm going to come right over here and I'm simply going to punch in a value of about 40. I think that's pretty good. Now you'll see that a keyframe has been added right in here, but nothing has been added off the top. But you're going to notice as I move back, this value is actually changing. Well, remember, this master keyframe is basically setting the parameters for everything right down, including everything from position to pivot to camera. So I don't need to get in and add additional keyframes there if I don't want to. So let me just drop down position again, because you'll see when I get all the way back here to the beginning, we're back at that value of 100. But of course now that brings up a new problem. So what's going to happen when I get to these keyframes? And I'm going to start moving down to the end because I have this other master keyframe down here. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to come back to these two keyframes here. I'm going to move ahead one frame, and then I'm going to add a keyframe in here. I'm actually just going to punch in the value of 40 again to be the same. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the value of the keyframe interpolation here from ease in, ease out, and I'm going to change it to hold. So basically what's going to happen now is that once I get to this keyframe and I move to the next frame, these keyframes are going to tell the effect to hold all the way to the end. It's going to hold that parameter right down. Perfect. And what I want to do is I want to have about a 6 frame hold before this element moves off to the left. So let's move down 6 frames. That's going to take us to 1 second and 2 frames here. There we go, 1 second and 2 frames. Very nice. What we're going to do now is, again, we're going to come over, we're going to add in a keyframe for position. You'll see now that I have a value of 640 right dead in the middle of the screen, which is exactly what I want. So how do I get in and set this keyframe? Well, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to want an interpolation of ease in and ease out. So what I'm going to do is simply select ease in and ease out, and you'll see as soon as I do, keyframes have been added for the X and the Y value. Now, I don't really mind if one's been added for the Y value because it's not really going to be adjusted, but obviously if you didn't want it, you can get in and delete it if you need to. Now, of course, what's going to happen here is we're going to come all the way down to the end, very last frame, and we're simply going to come up and I'm going to grab my OpenGL interactor here, and I'm just going to take this element, make sure I grab it there we go, and I'm just going to drag it right off frame, just like that. So let's preview this to see what we have going on. I'm going to hit Command and 0 on the keyboard. You're going to see there is our scale right down, and then here's our move off right there. So in most cases, people might be happy with this, looking very nice, and they might want to just come down and hit apply and keep working inside a Media Composer, but I'm not entirely happy with it. I want to add one more parameter. I want to add that motion blur parameter. Now I should also point out, you'll see that I have that ease in, so it slows down right when it gets to that keyframe. If I wanted to change that, obviously what I could do is simply come back here. I could change this value to, let's say, linear, and you're going to see that we get a very different effect. The scale basically comes down and slams into place, no slowdown, and then moves out. Now remember, I have that ease in and ease out on the move there. That's why I think I'm going to stick with an ease in and ease out. So I'm just going to undo what I just did, and I can preview this again if I want to. Remember, it's not going to preview everything because I only altered these keyframes here, and because the interpolation is to ease, that's why it has to preview this entire section here. Very nice. So let's get in and add motion blur. Now, like I said, I can do a lot of the work from right down here from within my timeline. Let's take a look if we can do the same thing with motion blur. What we're going to do is we're just going to come right down here to motion blur, and you'll see, where's motion blur? There we go. If I come right back to the beginning here, I'm just going to hit home on the keyboard. You'll see right now the shutter angle is set to 180. Well, I think I'm going to bump that up a bit. I like a little bit more motion blur when I'm working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this to be 360. Now, what's obviously important to keep in mind is that as soon as I punch in 360, you'll see for this parameter, a keyframe has been added. But what happens is, again, remember, because I have this master keyframe down here at the end, this value is going to go back to 180. Well, again, this is where we're going to use our keyframe interpolation. I'm simply going to come back, and what I'm going to do is switch it from ease in and ease out to be constant. That way the value is always going to be 360 the entire way through. Now in this case, I didn't have any other keyframes in the timeline for me to have to worry about. That's why I simply set it to constant. It's not like I wanted this to bump around to different values where I would have used something like hold. Constant, a fantastic keyframe interpolation to have access to inside of Avid Effects. Now you're going to see that we got something going on here though. As I move down, the motion blur is not actually there. Well, there is something for motion blur that I can't set from down here within the timeline. Let's navigate right up to the controls window. Let's come to motion blur because I can't actually enable it from right down here inside the timeline. So let's just enable motion blur, and you'll see I'm actually just going to come over here. I'm going to turn off my title safe just so you can see this a bit better. There we go, nice. As soon as I turn on motion blur, you'll see that we now have a very cool looking motion blur, and I can just hit Command and 0 to preview this with the motion blur. And we now have access to something else that we've never had access to before inside of Media Composer 6 and Symphony 6, and that is motion blur, which just gives this effect an extra layer of realism. Fantastic. So I'm happy with this. So what we're going to do is navigate right over here. We're going to hit apply. Let's just make sure I don't call up the dock there. I'm going to hit apply, and you'll see there's the transition. Of course, again, I have to hit Shift and F2, which is my shortcut for rendering. Obviously, you're going to want to get in and either use your shortcut for render, or you can simply use the button at the top of the timeline. And now that our render's done, let me just step out of effects mode here. I'm just going to come back, hit play. And there's our very cool transition. Very nice.